Welcome to episode 129 of Closer Mentality. I'm your host, Julia Mellett. Today's guest, Jess Lapachinski, has experience working with both the youth and collegiate athlete populations, and she has a unique viewpoint on introducing mental skills to the next generation of elite competitors. When she was introduced to sport, she and her sister were only in what Lapachinski referred to as, quote, girls' sports.
I grew up in the era of being shuffled into girls' sports. So I danced. I did a lot of various dance when I was young. And I had two parents who both were relatively athletic, but neither one of which had a distinct background in sport growing up. And so I did a lot of dance growing up. It was probably around middle school when I started having an interest in sport. And so I played baseball. I did not grow up playing softball, but I played baseball. And then when I started high school, that's when I started playing softball and really gravitated towards that. So that's what I played predominantly growing up. Loved softball, played a little bit of soccer. And yeah, but definitely when I was younger, my parents had us, gymnastics, ballet, dance, things like that. My older sister and I did that.
Lapachinski was playing everything she could get onto a roster for until she got to high school. She started experiencing significant pain when she ran, which led to a compartment syndrome diagnosis. Compartment syndrome is caused by high pressure in muscle compartments, which restricts blood flow to tissue, manifesting as numbness or tightness of the muscle group. Acute cases are normally precipitated by trauma like fractures, but chronic cases like Lapachinski's arise due to intense exercise and overexertion.
When I was in high school, again, I played a lot of softball and I started having issues in my lower legs. And when I was running, I would get a lot of pain. And so I was really fortunate. I went to a private school where we had an athletic trainer, and I worked daily with my athletic trainer on what was going on with my legs. And I was diagnosed with an injury, compartment syndrome in my lower legs. And I wanted to learn so much about that because I just kept thinking, something is happening here. I can still play sport, but it's not, maybe feeling as great as it should. And so what's going on here? And so I started learning a lot through Randy, my athletic trainer. And that's kind of where I was bit by the bug with, okay, well, if we learn how the body operates, you can kind of figure out what's happening and then you can address it.
Her personal injury experience steered Lapachinski toward a bachelor's degree in kinesiology from UMass Amherst. She wanted to understand why her body reacted to overexertion and how she could prevent others from reaching that point.
That's the path that I took out of high school. I originally went to college to be an athletic trainer. Very quickly learned that immediate kind of acute injuries was not something that I was going to be able to deal with, and pivoted and then studied kinesiology and exercise science and just learned a lot about the way that the body worked. Injury forces us to really kind of examine what's important to us, and it also allowed me to pivot. And so at that point in my life, I knew that probably playing collegiate sports, unless I was going to go to the surgery route and all that stuff, was not in the cards for me. And so I kind of accepted that. And that enabled me to pivot. And that's when I really started training. I got myself into running and really kind of pivoted again. Like when team sports are no longer available to us as athletes, we have to figure out what is available and how can we make that work and what brings us joy. And so I actually had that experience probably earlier than most, but I really credit that time in my life for figuring out how I can make athletics and sport a part of my everyday life, even after team sports ends.
Lapachinski took her athletic experience and her degree in body movement and transposed them onto youth athletes like she had been.
When I was an undergrad, I just wanted to study what I wanted to learn about. And so that's why I went the kinesiology route. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I graduated college and continued to take some education courses. My mom worked in education and my sister was kind of headed towards that path, my older sister. And I just kept thinking, okay, maybe this is a path that I'll pursue. And then I was searching for jobs early in my career and had an opportunity to go to work at a boarding school, and I loved it. And so I kind of took that first step. I worked in alumni events and fundraising. I was originally hired as part of a campaign team. But again, who I was at that point was I was training, I was working out. I remember actually training and doing a lot of different like fitness stuff with my colleagues at that time. And that, I mean, that's who I was, right? And so I knew that at some point, maybe I'd pursue some sort of master's education and go back into like a sport path. But at that time, I was just kind of, I was in my early 20s. I was going through the motions, like trying to make some money and figure it out. And so at some point I knew, I wanted to kind of pivot back into working in athletics. Um, but at the time it was just kind of like, all right, well, we'll throw some stuff at the wall here and see what sticks.
The aforementioned boarding school, Deerfield Academy, welcomed Lapachinski into a fundraising position separate from sports entirely, and it was a role she succeeded in. She loved relationship building and hints of the teamwork she'd gotten so accustomed to in sports. When she began traveling with Deerfield Academy's director of athletics, a path into sport administration opened up.
I traveled a ton in my first couple of years working there because I worked as part of a campaign team. We were raising money. I traveled with the director of athletics at one point. He was a speaker at one of our events, and I got to know him a little bit and really liked him and thought he was smart and creative and ran a really amazing athletic program at the school. And a job opened up over in the athletic department, and I applied and then moved over into that role. I knew that I wanted to pursue a master's in sport management, sport leadership, and spent a couple of years in the athletic department before I pursued that. Maybe 1 year. Anyway, then I pursued my master's in sport leadership through Northeastern. I did that full time when I was working, and that it was such a great program. I learned so much, had a great time. Um, and was able to kind of use those skills in real time and apply them to my work. So that was really fun. That was also a time where I was just kind of growing as a professional and figuring out what I wanted to do next, and knew that athletic administration was a path that I was on, and I was really engaged and motivated to be in. One of the cool things about working in a private boarding school is that I had an opportunity to do a little bit of everything. It was event management. I got my strength and conditioning certification and did some work with our teams there. I coached a little bit and did some, coaching at the varsity level. But then I was also, athletic event management and tournaments and things like that. And so it's such a small shop that you have an opportunity to do a little bit of everything. That's so cool because you can quickly figure out, okay, like this is what I really like, this is what I don't like. And so, and then the natural progression, right? Is just to kind of continue up the ladder until, you enter either an associate AD or an AD role or whatever it might be. And so, um, I think when I started and even now, it wasn't as though, this is the end goal or this is what I'm trying to do. It was just kind of like, all right, I love working with great people. I love working in places where I feel like I can do really meaningful work. How can I keep stacking that to feel like I'm adding value and I'm doing something of value that I feel for me? And so that's kind of the path that I took and continue to take, to be honest.
The intersection of sport administration and body movement opened the door to a world of sports psychology, further adding tools to Lapachinski's athlete support toolbox. She became a Swiss Army knife of sport leadership.
So sports psychology came a little bit later for me, but when I look back, it just makes complete sense in my brain, I guess. So my first master's degree was in sport leadership. I had a capstone project towards the end of my master's, and the capstone project that I did was, all these leadership development programs started popping up in collegiate athletics at the time. And I thought, okay, well, let me do some work here where I can research and figure out, one of the things that popped up in the research was we appoint these captains, but we didn't actually provide them with any skills or training or competency to actually engage that role and really kind of lead. And so what came out of that capstone project that I did was developing this leadership curriculum. and working with a couple of colleagues at the boarding school and moving in this path that had us, okay, these are the skills that we want these leaders to have in athletics. So how can we teach them, right? How can we collaborate in a way that makes sense? And so, but out of that also came this optional course that we taught, and the demand for that was overwhelming. We were so excited about these sophomores and juniors who just kind of opted into learning about these sport leadership skills through this optional course that we taught. And I started just kind of realizing certain things. I started to realize that these high level, these are some of the brightest students in the world, the most accomplished athletes in the world. They were focused on feelings and emotions and outcomes. And so I just kind of started just recognizing that, I guess. And then the further I got down the road in that role, I just kind of thought, okay, this is something that I'd like to learn more about. Then in my last year at Deerfield, I taught ninth grade health. And that was so fun and so interesting for so many reasons. But the class period was really long. And I remember, you're trying to keep these ninth graders engaged. And so I would kind of toss out these questions every now and again. And because of my background in athletics, they would often be about resilience or leadership or, the way that you think. And we would talk about, how to deal with setbacks and mistakes and things like that. And we would just kind of have these 5 or 8 minute discussions, sometimes like in the middle of class, just to break things up. And again, I started to think about, these are some of the most smart students, most amazing students for so many reasons. And they would struggle with these little, they would experience some sort of setback and then not be able to get through it, and in a really kind of quick or effective manner. And so that's when I started to think, okay, I need to learn more about this because this is going to help me become a better teacher. And this is going to help me become just a better, professional in general, working in this area of sport.
Lapachinski opted to amplify her sport repertoire with a Master of Education in Sports Psychology from Springfield College in Springfield, Massachusetts.
That really encouraged me. Even though I left Deerfield and came here to Amherst, that's when I went back to school. I got my second master's degree in sport and exercise psychology. And that's when I started to really think about how athletes think and why they might think the way that they do.
Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless of if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human in this world going through a hard time, therapy can give you the tools to approach your life in a positive way. That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible. This is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options just in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. If this sounds like something that could help you, there's a link in the show notes to get you started on your therapy journey. It's betterhelp.com/closer mentality. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. Because finding a therapist is a little like dating. If you don't really fit with the therapist matched with you, it's easy and free to switch therapists without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/closer mentality. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/closer mentality. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this channel. Did you know that you can purchase audiobooks directly from your favorite local bookstore? With Libro FM, you can pick from more than 325,000 audiobooks, including bestsellers and recommendations from real booksellers. You'll get the same audiobooks at the same price as the largest audiobook company out there, you know the name. But you'll be part of a different story, one that supports your local community. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to squeeze more reading into your busy life. Listen with the free Libro FM app while you do chores, walk the dog, or relax at home. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out recommendations from the people who know best, booksellers. Closer Mentality has partnered with Libro FM on a special offer. Through the link in the show notes, you can get 2 audiobooks on Libro FM for the price of 1. Offer only valid for new members in Canada and the US. Thanks to Libro FM for sponsoring this podcast.
Lapachinski decided that her place in the athlete support system would be a holistic take on the athlete experience. She could combat difficult conversations from a 3-tiered approach: mental, physical, and sport administration and coaching. She also acknowledged that the population most needing that kind of input was that same 9th grade age range. Lapachinski saw those students as the perfect demographic to introduce mental skills. In such a formative place in their lives, many of them lacked the correct ways to articulate their feelings.
I think 14 is an age where it's obviously still very young, but it has the capacity to think about the patterns and to think about actions and behaviors and how all of these different things kind of interact. That said, I have 2 children under the age of 10, and we'll for sure talk about breathing techniques and mindfulness techniques and how to be present and how to take a breath before you talk with a friend if you're having a disagreement or things like that. And so there are some basic skills that can be incorporated at almost any age. But when you get really kind of into the, performance minded, resilient reset type things, like I would say, that 13, 14 age is probably a benchmark to where that stuff starts to really stick.
These mental skills, although pertinent in sport environments, transcend sport and easily become the building blocks of communication, determination, and drive. Instilling these basics in youth students and student athletes became Lapachinski's mission.
Thankfully, I think social media and everything that we have access to as sports fans is helping drive this conversation, right? I mean, 10, 20 years ago, it was not common to see a sports psychologist or a mental performance coach on the sideline, right? And now it is. And people, athletes talk openly about how important that is. And so it's not necessarily for me about selling why this is important. It's about making it accessible to all populations of athletes. And so that has been a really cool shift. Some of my clients actually come through either a parent referral or a coach. What's interesting about working with youth athletes is that they've got to understand and have the desire, right? Like you have to have a motivation in order to kind of get better in this space. And so it's a fine line between, a parent saying like, oh, my child needs help versus saying, we've talked about this and this is something that we want to pursue together for a host of reasons, right? And so the conversation starts different for everyone. Just as every athlete, every client, every child is unique, it usually starts with, okay, here's what I'm experiencing. Here are my goals. Here are the pressures that I'm facing in my sport. And how can I learn to think a little bit differently about that? That's really the root of the conversation or at least how we start the conversation is, what is it that you're hoping to accomplish? Are there certain skills that you feel like you're lacking? And so much of it is really having an outlet that's not a parent or a coach to help us make sense of these things in our mind.
Are you an athlete rehabbing from an injury? Are you a coach or athletic trainer seeking additional support for your injured athlete toolkits? KT Tape has exactly what you need. KT Tape is a rehabilitation tape that helps stabilize and compress sensitive areas of the body during exercise. Apply KT Tape to an area either in pain or in recovery and feel the difference. KT Tape is comfortable, stable, and long-wearing. There's tape for all modes of action, from gentle, which is safe for easy activity and everyday use, to pro extreme, for athletes in moderate to high-impact exercise. KT Tape makes water-resistant tape as well for a more adaptable rehabilitation implementation. KT Tape caters to lifelong athletes and focuses on reducing muscle soreness for all users when worn during exercise and up to 48 hours post. Are you an athlete in need of prescription sports goggles or sunglasses? Today's final sponsor may have just the solution for you. A Sight for Sport Eyes was created when founder Shannon Knight saw a niche that was perpetually going unfulfilled. A site for sport eyes grew out of a need for education surrounding the impact of sport-related eye injuries and their lasting repercussions. A site for sport eyes runs like a regular optical practice, not an e-commerce store. Their goal is to give you the same high-quality service and name-brand lenses made by the best optical laboratories in the country, geared specifically for athletes and athletic use cases. If you need new lenses or frames, a site for sport eyes is the perfect place to get them. The links to BetterHelp.com, Libro.fm, KT Tape, and a site for sport eyes are all in the show notes. Now, let's get back to the episode.
Lapachinski gave a nod to social media for the ease in conceptualizing and sharing mental health stories. Very few of the student athletes she works with now are having their first experience with mental skills while working with her. They infrequently need to be convinced of the mental game's impact.
There's a difference in athletes coming out today, but I was actually just thinking about this. I'm a Patriots fan, and I was watching the Patriots play, in the playoffs this year. And Drake May, their quarterback, is really young. I think he's 23 years old. He came out of UNC and was really successful there. I think he comes from a long line of athletes in his family. And part of me was thinking, okay, so his demeanor on the field is so interesting to me because he doesn't seem to ever get rattled. He doesn't get too high. He doesn't get too low. He's just very even keeled no matter what happens. And he moves on really quickly. And so as someone with a background in sports psychology, I'm watching these games and I'm thinking, okay, is that because he has been working with sports psychologists for, 5, 6, 7 years? Because I'm sure he had access to all of this at UNC. And now with the Patriots, of course, or is he just built like that? Like, what is this change that we're seeing? And it's interesting because so much of it too also comes to like just personality traits, right? And, but I think about this concept all the time because I think I'm hopeful that we will start to see this change. However, the youth sport landscape is so influential in the sport experience and the way that we think as athletes. And so I think what we are seeing more of now is athletes are entering these spaces where they haven't struggled as much as they used to in previous years, in previous generations of sport. And so maybe they've gravitated towards a specific sport because they've been really good at it and they put all their eggs in their basket and tried to, pursue collegiate athletics and in just one single sport. That's what specialization has done, right? So it's interesting to think about this because I could see it going both ways. Either they're entering the sport arena and haven't actually struggled a lot, and so we're going to see that unfold in real time, or they've had access to sports psychology resources for many more years before they actually hit the professional sport arena, and we're going to see them be able to handle this a little bit better. It's interesting.
Mental skills training has become a chicken or the egg situation. Are athletes struggling less? Or are they just better equipped to handle the pressures presented because of robust support systems? The NCAA did a full study to determine which informed the other. Between September 2022 and June 2023, more than 23,000 student athletes from all 3 NCAA divisions weighed in. The study revealed that mental health concerns were generally down, especially in Division I male student athletes. Female student athletes also reported fewer mental health concerns, though not as surprising. This study monitored general reluctance in speaking with coaching staff and sport admin, to which both male and female athletes ranked E's. Nearly 70% of student athletes noted someone within the athletic department that they felt comfortable speaking with for support.
I think you got to have a really high level circle around you of people who you can trust. And that's at any level, even at the youth level, right? I think you've got to have people who care about who you are and value you as you. And I also think that, the relationship that we have with ourselves is the longest relationship we're going to have in our lives. And it's also the most important. One of the big skills I'm constantly working with athletes, especially young athletes, is just how to talk to yourself, how to listen to yourself, how to be kind to yourself, how to offer self-compassion. I think that is so huge because we start to believe that And what's going on in our subconscious is so important because it's essentially how we feel about ourselves and how we react to certain things, and just influences so much about ourselves. And it's really unhealthy to hear negative things about ourselves or to be beating ourselves up. And it's also really important to not have that from the circle that we hear from all the time. So that comes from parenting, that comes from coaching, that comes from friends and mentors and the people who are closest to us. Those relationships are so important about our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health. That is just that to me is one of the most important relationships we have, is the relationship with our health, with ourselves, and then the relationship of the handful of people who are closest to us. That to me is really going to indicate how, like, our holistic well-being and our day-to-day, level of enjoyment and happiness and acceptance of who we are. There's a lot of rough coaching out there, and there's a lot of great coaching out there. And it's, one thing that we're seeing in the youth sport landscape that, parents, it's funny because parents, when you think about the education system and you think about all the requirements that are there versus the lack of requirements that we often see in youth sport coaching, parents do a lot in terms of discerning what type of environment is going to be helpful and healthy for their children when it comes to education. I don't know that that same level of, detective work is happening in the sport culture. And that's something that can really have a huge effect on your child. So if you're a youth athlete and you're getting some pretty tough coaching from either a club sport coach or your rec coach, whatever it might be, whatever that environment is, that's going to really have an effect on your self-esteem in sport in terms of who you are, how you think about yourself. And youth athletes, especially, below high school age, right? They're not always going to be able to discern what that coaching looks like, as opposed to someone who's in high school and be like, what's up with this, and so that's really where your parents and support system come in. And they play such an important part in the sport experience as a whole. It can really have an influence on mindset.
Lapachinski said that as youth athletes reach for higher potentials, and parents request more of youth coaches, the grandfathering in of negative coaching behaviors and techniques should fall by the wayside. As athlete autonomy grows, so does intolerance of toxic coaching practices, even within the youth sport landscape.
Science will tell us that we coach how we were last coached. So if we were last coached from an old school kind of, no autonomy, iron fist type ruler, then we may have those coaching tendencies as well. And that's not really going to fly these days. So, I think admins, to answer your original question, admins have a responsibility to student athletes to ensure that the environment is safe and things like that. And to be an ear, right? If there's either, coaching up needed or whatever it might be. So I think admins play a role, but when you get to a specific level, oftentimes it's about hiring the right people.
As athlete autonomy grows, so also does the platform given to speak about the emotional wavelength of the athlete experience.
Sport and performance psychology has changed, or at least influenced, the way that I think in so many ways. It's also provided me with this kind of peel back the curtain into the athlete experience. But I also think that so much of the student athlete experience right now, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about experience, we're talking about pressures and challenges that we've never seen before in 10, 20 years, right? And so and I think the next 10 plus years of sports are going to be about mental health and how we're feeling and the emotions that we have during sport. And whereas years ago in old school coaching, it's like, don't cry or don't put your emotions or leave your baggage at the door. And all of these things are just no longer acceptable, right? And so that's when I think it's, there's a distinct line between athlete experience and the work that we do as admins to ensure resources and opportunity and access to those resources for athletes. I think that's incredibly important. I mean, everyone's time playing competitive sports eventually comes to an end. And that's such a loss in so many different ways. We think about the benefits of, social benefits that sport offers us, and then the physical benefits that sport offers us, and the emotional benefits that sport offers us. And there's so many layers to the sport experience that all of a sudden it's just over. And that's incredibly hard. I mean, if you think about Olympians, you think about professional athletes, you think about collegiate athletes with really robust careers, even high school athletes, there's a time when our sport experience comes to an end. And I think because it has such an impact on our time, who we are as a person, and it's easy to think about performance as part of who we are because it's our brains and our body that's performing. And so that's why it feels so personal. And so, I mean, athletic identity is so big and so important, and there's so many layers to it that it affects us in every way. And I think that that's something that the more in it you are and the higher levels that you compete at, I think that the larger the athletic identity typically is. And that's why it's so robust when our time ends.
Thank you so much for listening to episode 129 of Closer Mentality. And thank you to Jess Lapachinski for sharing her story this week. You can watch Jess and I's full interview on the Closer Mentality Uncensored YouTube channel. All other pertinent links are in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Closer Mentality. As always, I'm your host, Julia Mellett. See you next week.